Welcome everyone to our second AltAc workshop series of 2021, and I think maybe our fifth or sixth overall. I think I've lost count here for meet and greets with really cool rock stars. A few people are new to the group, and so I want to make sure that we kind of provide them a little introduction. So my name is Shannon Magnuson. I'm a research associate at Justice System Partners, which is this small nonprofit research firm that operates in the AltAc space. I am joined by my very amazing colleague, Kate Kempney. Kate, do you want to introduce yourself real quickly?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Joining from Portland, Oregon here. Again, my name is Kate Kempney. I am a research scientist with the Oregon Department of Corrections, having so much fun working my dream job on a day-to-day basis. So.
That's right. So Kate graduated from Arizona State, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate at George Mason. So we both work in AltAc spaces, but are in different parts of our career. So I'm new to the AltAc space and still in school, where Kate has been in the AltAc space and gets to tout her PhD letters around everywhere she goes. The series here is sponsored by the ASC's division on corrections and sentencing, so DCS. So we're really excited to have a DCS sponsor here. That's Dr. Danielle Ruse. So she's in the quarter. She might turn her video off here shortly, but we're grateful for her support and for DCS's support for allowing us to do this, for helping sponsor it, for getting the word out, and helping us think through how we can provide extra resources to students. But we are definitely not here to talk about me or Kate or Danielle. We're here to talk about our rock star, Zach Drake. We're so excited for him to come and join us. So a little bit about Zach, but I'm not going to inundate us with a little biography of him. Just some high level facts. I met Zach at George Mason, where he's studying for his PhD. While at George Mason, he was working at Booz Allen, a consulting firm in the DC metro area, and then moved to Deloitte, which is a larger consulting firm in the DC metro area. We call this, we're going to do our very best to not use consulting jargon, because I know that it's new for some of you. For us who live in the DC metro area or other large metropolitan cities, consulting language is pretty common. We call them the Beltway bandits in the DC metro area. It's all of the consultants that live and just basically breathe and live outside the 495 or 395 corridor. So they're called the Beltway bandits. And so consulting is a very large part of life in the DC metro area, which includes Virginia and Maryland, but it may not be as large of life in other places. While he left Deloitte recently and joined Reuters Special Services, so he's going to talk to us a little bit about how Reuters is different from Deloitte and Booz and other consulting firms. And he's also going to talk to us about his own consulting firm, which is amazing. And then how he kind of also doing on top of all of that and being a new father and about to be an even new father, how he also is an adjunct professor at 2 universities in the DC metro area, at George Mason and at American. So welcome, Zach. We're excited to have you. Super excited to have you. So, I think one thing that we're most excited about is that, at least in my experience, and I think perhaps in Kate's experience in Arizona, we don't really talk about consulting spaces a lot. It's not something that's discussed, what it looks like, what it doesn't look like, what it is, what it isn't, especially if you're outside of a DC metro area, or let's say maybe the Boston area, where there's also a lot of consulting happening, right? And so, before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of what consulting is, can you just talk to us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, how you got here, and all those kind of like special skills that you may or may not have collected along the way?
Special skills. That's the hard one. Yeah, you gave a great intro there. My name's Zach. I am working on my PhD. I'm in the proposal stages of dissertation. I'm one of those people that should have been ABD 3 years ago and still doesn't have his proposal finished. So I'm working on my PhD here. I originally came from the Atlanta area, and I moved up to DC area specifically to go to George Mason, specifically to hold on, the lights in my office just turned off. There we go. They're motion sensing. I guess I just wasn't moving very enough. And so, I moved up to the DC area for graduate school, and now, I'm still in school, and could probably pull what Shannon pulled, and get to candidacy and then dip out and find a better place to live. But for now, this is where I'm at for the time being. And yeah, to your point, so the consulting space has always been a big thing for people getting masters and PhDs in the hard sciences, or the physical sciences is a better term there, in things like business and economics. It's always been common for those. For us in the social sciences, and particularly in like the sociology, criminology space, that's never really been a thing. And here in the DC area, we're lucky that most of the clients of consulting are government agencies that can leverage that.
Mhm.
There's more work being done in the private sector. When I was at Deloitte, we're doing some of that, where there's an application for things like sociology and criminology in newer ways than there used to be, because organizations are just interested in that, interested in how they can reduce their own insider crime, right? So if you're trying to enforce something like a cybersecurity policy, how can you take what we know about crime prevention in preventing robberies and apply that to preventing, internal cyber breaches in your own organization? Or from a sociology standpoint, what can we take about how we know in-groups and out-groups form in broader societies and use that to understand your organization better? Not unlike courses that at some criminology programs like at Mason, we have part of our curriculum courses very similar to that, right? Of how you can use a social science approach to understanding organizational management. Dr. Roots teaches that course, or at least you were when I was took it 5 years ago. So there's a unique application here in the DC area, but like I said, that's expanding to other markets, to other contexts. There's also this new world of what's often called data science or analytics, or all these things that are taking rigorous scientific quantitative analysis and applying it to different problems. What can you apply research and good quantitative rigorous research to learn about the population of a city, to aid some kind of organizational planning, or city planning, or even in a business case, if it's purely profit driven, I want to understand my customers better, and I want to do that in a rigorous way. And as social science PhDs, regardless of the specificity within that, most of us here are criminal justice, criminology. As social science PhDs, that's what we do, is we're very good at taking quantitative rigor and understanding people. And in the modern age, where there's just data abundant and there's capabilities abundant, there's this new growing need for that in so many new sectors of just how do we take all this data and rigorously understand people? And that's just going to open up a wealth of opportunities for people who get PhDs in the social sciences to go find careers they never thought they would have. I've met people, particularly at Deloitte, that got PhDs in things like sociology or even economics and these broader, social science fields. And now they're working and helping, understand healthcare signups, and how can you do things like, economic nudging to encourage people to get onto like healthcare programs in an organization, and things you never would have thought as a social scientist that you'd end up doing. And they love it because it's the same skills and the same thing. You're just answering different research questions.
Sure. So before we kind of get into kind of what the research questions are in those spaces, or what they could be, right? Can we set like a bit of a boundary, some boundaries, or a sandbox? So for some of us who are new to this idea of consulting, right? Help define us, like, what is a consulting firm and what do consulting firms do?
Yeah. So a consulting firm it's essentially a company that just hires people because they're smart and skilled, and then goes to other people who need smart and skills and say, we have a team that can do that, for X amount an hour, and we can help you solve that. It looks different in different spaces. In the government space, typically the government has like very well defined, they'll put out not unlike a grant proposal, but they'll put out a request for proposals for like a contracting, and it'll be very clear of like, we need someone who can help us solve this problem. Here's what we know about it. We're open to basically any ideas of how to solve it. And then we would put together a proposal saying, hey, we would probably take this approach, and we have a team of people, and here's their background and skill sets. And for 1 year at this X dollar rate, they will work on that problem and try and help solve it. And then there's a contractual agreement. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the grant process that we're familiar with in academia. The difference is, one, it's very profit driven because it is private sector. And two, we're not looking to simply answer a new thing for the field. There's a very defined problem that needs to be solved, and we're just applying questions to that specific problem. And so these firms have just grown over the years of, typically they're capability based. So you'll have consulting firms that are they do one thing. Like my firm, we do one thing, right? And we do that well, and we staff it with people who try to solve that, and we can help you solve this problem. I can't help you solve all these other problems. But then you have bigger firms, the Beltway bandits, as you have described, that have grown to be 10, 20, 200,000 people of vast numbers of skills and vast pockets of specialization who do a lot of different things. And typically within those, they'll have practices where they have managing directors of all of their criminal justice stuff, and then they just work on criminal justice stuff. There's 500 people who work in that little sector, and they work there. So it's like smaller companies that make up one bigger company. And yeah, in the government space, government has problems, and we try to propose solutions. And if they like our solution, they pay us to help them figure it out and implement it. In the private space, it's a little less defined. You'll have companies who, just through relationships will say, we have a problem. And then we say, hey, here's an approach we could take to solve that. And then there's an agreement established there.
That's right. So then thinking about that there's kind of private sector work, that there's public sector work, and that there's an industry, right, that often consulting spaces are divided by industry. So let's say healthcare consulting, right, tax and auditing consulting, financial consulting, management consulting, right, that there are also larger firms that do it all or consider themselves to have done it all. So we have kind of big firms. We have, there's in the industry, they're called kind of the big four or the big three, depending on if you're talking about financial consulting or management consulting. And then you have kind of medium firms. So I'm going to put a list in the chat of firms that I came up with recently, and that Zach helped me come up with, and then kind of what they're known as, right? So in the industry, you wouldn't necessarily call it PricewaterhouseCoopers, you would just call it PwC, for example. Yeah. And so kind of what's in there and how they're referred, right? So those are some big, there's some medium in there, and then there are boutiques. So generally speaking, why do folks head to consulting firms to do work? Like, what's their lure of like going there?
Yeah. So for me personally, I love doing research and I love applying those skills, but I like solving a real hard problem. For me, unraveling the mysteries of the universe and confirming and denying theories and hypotheses is fun. And that's important because that's where we get the basis for how we propose evidence-based policies. But I much more enjoy being on the practitioner side of the, hey, there's a specific problem and we want to apply something to that. We need understanding about that. And there's a cross there, traditionally there's been places where academia will take grants from agencies to do that, and that's very common. Of particularly more like state and federal agencies will have centers like ACE at Mason or CEBCP come in and do an assessment or help them plot some kind of planning thing. Consulting firms just do that, crank that out on a more regular basis, right? So in that case, we would be looking at, if you're the kind of person that enjoys taking a problem and a specific problem and finding a specific solution to that problem, consulting allows you to do that on a very frequent pace. When I was on on consulting projects, our projects typically only last a month or two. Sometimes they can be longer for like a year if it's a bigger project, but it's constant changing of what we're working on. And even with the same customer, the problems change constantly. We're not really working on 2 to 3 year grant projects like you would in academia. We're working on very short turnarounds of, the X agency wants this done and they need an answer in a week. And we'll be like, okay, well, in a week, you're going to get this. You asked for this, you're going to get this. And then we'll have those conversations and then we'll work on it and give them what we have. And then that might lead to something else. So it's also, I think if you want to be able to branch out, it's a really interesting way, because if you go to one of the bigger firms, like I've gotten the chance to work on things like healthcare fraud, which has a very criminology application to it, but I don't know anything about healthcare other than I know how to like make an appointment at my healthcare providers. And that's about the extent of my knowledge of healthcare. So like that would not be something I would have gotten to do at a strictly criminal justice firm, because that would have gone to a more healthcare firm, right? Who might have hired criminologists to help with that. But at Deloitte, because we had both, we had people who did criminal justice and security and people who did healthcare, we were able to put those teams together and help solve that problem for Medicare and Medicaid. So that's just an also thing. Like if you want to be able to expand and play in different areas and different fields, consulting, especially with the bigger firms, gives you an opportunity to do that.
Okay, that's awesome. So then thinking about that is that it sounds like the bigger firm allows you opportunity of more subjects, let's say. But let's say a medium or a boutique firm, kind of what would be the benefit of being at a medium or a boutique firm then?
Yeah, so upfront and honest, pay is better. Just to be frank, consulting is very lucrative for a lot of reasons. And I know a lot of people who can get astronomically better offers than monetarily than what they would be getting in more think takey research kind of places, nonprofit spaces. With that though comes a time commitment. It's a trade-off. It's not just it's not just like, hey, we'll pay you more. Like there's higher expectations for sure, especially when it comes to time commitments. So that's one, right? Of the smaller firms. Two is, again, if you like just working on specific problems, but you want to be very action oriented, going to like a specifically criminal justice research firm, or usually they're typically more like criminal justice and homeland security firms, and working on just those specific problems, it gives you an ability to just focus on solving the problem and working on creating solutions, as opposed to working on more broader kind of overarching big academic questions, right? So like if you're the kind of person who wants to be able to provide the next big nuance to routine activities theory that everyone starts citing, consulting is not the place you're going to do that. You're just not going to have those opportunities, right? I will probably never be published in a journal like criminology, because I'm just not set up to get the grants and have the big overarching questions to do that, right? But if you like to just take the problem and create a direct solution, take all the stuff we learned over the last 8 years of grad school or whatever, and come up with real world practical solutions, consulting is often a better place to do that, because it gives you direct access to the practitioners and you're brought in to actually be hands-on with what they're trying to do on a day-to-day.
That's for sure. I feel like the other thing I hear when you describe that too is that boutique firms or small firms, you're going to be offered more money, generally speaking, because there's not as many employees, but that the time it's in kind to the time commitment. You're going to be expected to work a lot, and a lot is not 40 hours, a lot is above, because the billing rate of how consulting works. So a lot of times they bill per hour, and so there are incentives built into the pay structure we'll get to in a minute that incentivizes you working beyond 40 hours. It also means you make above, it makes a lot more money, you make a lot of bonuses, but there's an expectation that you are likely going to be working over 40 hours. But the other thing about boutique firms that I'm hearing from you also is that you likely have more responsibility, right? And so that you could potentially be running things that you would be that would otherwise maybe you could be running a full team of things or a full answer to a question at a boutique firm, but in a place like Deloitte, you might be one of 10 people in a team answering that question.
Correct. Yeah. And to your point about the overseeing things, right? Finishing your PhD is entry level in academia. When you're in industry and consulting, having the PhD immediately makes you senior. And so typically, most of our staff have typically had masters or at least, advanced degrees or multiple degrees or something like that. It's typically very educated people, but oftentimes, the PhD level folks are immediately brought in at this more senior level position. And you do, like you said, the ability to have a team of people working for you where, and if that's something you enjoy, working with a team and running a team and planning what that all is going to look like is something that consulting gives you the opportunity to do coming out of a PhD program. Whereas when you go into traditional academia, starting as an assistant professor, you have zero standing, right? You don't get a lab to yourself, and you typically are working under associate professors and full professors who are setting more of the overall objectives there. So that's also a thing to your point, right? It is, when you go into these boutique firms and even at the big firms a little bit, and you come in with this deep expertise like you would get from a PhD, you end up with this ability to really start plotting directions and start having major impacts right away. At the bigger firms, you get that too, but there's ever so many levels that are making decisions of like kind of the direction of the things we want to solve and things we want to go after, that it's harder to play that. So yeah, that's an interesting observation.
Sure. Okay. So then thinking about, the work that you did. So Booz, we would say, I think it's fair to say Booz Allen Hamilton is maybe a medium firm. And I would say obviously Deloitte is a big firm in relative terms to one another, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about that, can you talk to us a little bit about what specifically does a research question look like there?
Yeah.
What does your day-to-day look like in those spaces?
Yeah. So I'm going to break that because my roles at the two firms were very different. And I think that there's an interesting dichotomy there. My role at Booz Allen was entirely policy implementation. And so I wasn't myself directly doing a lot of like answering research questions. We were managing or co-managing a project with the Department of Justice where they had a pot of money that went to training and technical assistance on a short term for local law enforcement and criminal justice agencies. And we were helping them evaluate the needs of those agencies and evaluate long-term spending trends and kind of helping make policy decisions of, the DOJ, it was a flexible amount of money Congress gave them every year. It's like, hey, DOJ, you've got X amount of, millions of dollars. These trainings, whether that's, something like, there was a big one on implicit bias training. This was before all the reviews came out showing that wasn't really worth all the money. But there was, going into like, hey, these agencies want to do implicit bias training. And so it's like, all right, well, here's providers that do that well. Here's evaluations of their trainings, helping them make cost determinations. And then here's the type of agencies that benefit from that. You've got agencies applying that can probably do that themselves, and working with the local practitioners to understand their needs better. And oftentimes they're like, oh, we need this. And you're like, no, actually you need this. And then we would go to DOJ and say, here's what they really need. And I got to work on some cool projects. I think the highlight of working there, we were working with Newark, New Jersey's police department. It was under consent decree from the Justice Department because they had police officers who, not unlike most agencies, were a little too trigger happy. And so in that, under that consent decree, they had to completely reevaluate their use of force policy. And so they needed funding to help do that because they were a little cash strapped, as most local agencies are. So they reached out to DOJ, went to this team of like, hey, can you help them get people in there to help them assess and reevaluate their use of force policy? My role in that was to be the mediator between, here's Newark PD and their captains and lieutenants who are saying what they want. We have other academics and experts who do specifically use of force, which is not my area of expertise. And so we had people who did that. We had other successful former law enforcement leaders that had done turnarounds on use of force policy at other places, and bringing all of those together to get what Newark needed and then help chart out the project management of what that would look like. And that was a lot of fun. That was a bigger project, and there was a little bit more project management and stuff there that probably wouldn't have personally. It's not in my wheelhouse. That most people probably wouldn't want to do either. But that was a cool project. I say that because last year in 2020, now pandemic skews a lot of this, but in 2020, Newark PD reported that they didn't have to draw a weapon all year. Not a single officer drew their weapon, and that is a result of the work we did 5 years ago of helping them reevaluate that use of force policy. And so now it's, that's a great connection of like, we were directly working with them. And then now 5 years later, we see that, hey, this local agency we're working with has a direct change because they went from being a very weapons heavy police department to a year where they didn't even unholster a weapon. And so that's oftentimes in the research space, you don't get to see those direct changes. Oftentimes in the research space, you'll put out, interesting insights about use of force, and they might get utilized, they might get not. You might see them get cited somewhere. You might see someone mention it in a news conference, something like that.
Right.
But in the consulting space, you can see direct changes, right? Where we can say, hey, we worked on this, we helped them do this, and that agency is better now 5 years later because of that. So I was doing a lot of that stuff at Booz Allen, mostly, of a lot of that direct connection between policy and practice kind of thing, and shaping it based off of evidence. It was in the transition between the Obama and Trump administrations, and under Obama, we called it evidence-based policy. That went out in 2016. It was called research-based policy. Same thing. But every time there's a change in administration, they change the name to make it look like it's something new. Yeah, that's not new to this transition. That's just politics in general. So we're doing a lot of research-based policy, as most of us would call evidence-based policy. At Deloitte, my job was much more sciencey, and much more researchy. And so at Deloitte, I was working on a couple of different things. I spent a little bit of time with an agency helping them design some quasi-experimental trials to assess some organizational structures. And so we were able to take their electronic planning system and randomize variables in it and see what it would spit out as outcomes, and then use those to measure predicted results, basically. So we were able to kind of randomize in like a simulated environment, and did some quasi-experimentation around that to help them determine some optimal parameters for their organizational setup. And it was cool. It ended up saving that agency about $30 million. And that was a traditional application of research skills. It was quasi-experimentation. It was thinking about internal validity. It was thinking about how do you create stratified reliable samples? How do you apply those to something like a regression model? And how do you evaluate the results of a statistical model and make inferences about that? That's everything you learn in a PhD program, how to do that. Were we answering an important academic theory question? No, we were trying to find a way to optimize a particular situation and save X amount of dollars for this, and it worked, right? And it's just the application of skills we all already have. Then there's the situation I told you where we were working on healthcare fraud, and we were trying to build predictive models, largely just logistic regressions, that could take all of their data, and we were trying to find reliable ways that we could flag when something looked like it was fraudulent, so an investigator could go look for it.
Sure.
And we had a research team that was doing more digging into academic literature, looking at known things that are patterns of fraud in all white collar research spaces, doing a little bit of their own qualitative reviews and looking at having some qualitative surveys with people to kind of get a good estimate, developing measures of fraud. And then we had a quantitative team, which is where I was at, that was implementing those and taking, okay, you said these are things, here's where we can create those constructs in the data and we can measure them, and working between them. Again, completely what we would do on a large kind of systematic grant proposal, right? And being funded by Medicare, Medicaid to do that in an academic space. It's the same skills. Difference there is we had like 6 months to turn this around, as opposed to like a few years to investigate this, and it was getting directly implemented, right? These models that we made got taken by software programmers and directly implemented in their system, and now they're continuously running and flagging cases for federal investigators. And that's a skill that requires not only deep statistical understanding, but like understanding of social science research methods. Like you have to have those are qualitative researchers that know how to do good structured qualitative interviews to understand what would be fraud, and how to do a good systematic lit review to understand what are things we should be paying attention to. And it took good social science quantitative scientists to say, here's how we can take data and create a logistic regression and account for all the things that we would account for in an academic sense. How do you account for heteroscedasticity? How do you account for, all of the statistical assumptions you're making? Is your sample stratified to be reliable? What are the limitations of this? And can you write those up in a way that someone could interpret them and say, okay, I understand you can't make this that? those are all things that we all spent, years doing. And everyone on that team had a master's or PhD in some kind of social science or healthcare research. Like I said, half of us came from like the social science, sociology world, criminology world, and then half of us came from like the MPH healthcare kind of world. And that's, another example project where that was what I would consider to be entirely a research project. It just didn't result in a paper. It didn't result in a publication. It resulted in models that are now running in a government system somewhere.
That's right. So thinking about that, some of the things that I'm hearing, right, are just that you are in these consulting spaces where you're doing research. Research might not look like you develop the research question, you develop the methods, you go do the data collection, you go analyze it, and then you write about it. It's in part that somebody brings you a research question already, that you might in part be developing the methods, then analyzing the data to answer the question, and then telling them, here's how you would solve it based upon that, and then them solving it, and then kind of letting it go and moving to your next thing, right? And doing that.
Yeah.
So if that is the process, then, I've heard that to be the process. And then I hear you talking about like having pretty strong quant skills in this space, having a good strong qual skills in this space. So thinking about, either at Booz or at Deloitte or other consulting firms, what are some skills that students need to be really successful there? And kind of what, like, for people who are really successful in these spaces, which could include soft skills too, what do those people look like, or what are they doing?
Yeah. So the number one skill before you learn analytical methods or anything like that is understanding how to frame a good testable research problem. Mm-hmm. Because as you point, people come to you with a problem. They come to you with what they think is the problem, or what they think is a research problem. And then oftentimes we have to say, okay, you said this. Now what that really means is this, this, and this, and here's what's testable, and helping break that apart. Again, skills that we should be developing in a PhD. Those are skills that we should all be developing over the course of getting a PhD, even a master's degree, I would say, in social sciences. So getting good at that is key, because if you run with just whatever research question you're given, oftentimes you're going to end up, off in a ditch because it's not going to work. It's often way too vague or way too specific, or it's not actually mirroring what they're actually doing in the field. And so that's part of it, is just working to massage those questions in a way it's like, this is really what we're trying to get at here, or this is what you're really trying to understand. And then once you have those questions, yes, then it's your point of like, okay, what's the best way to measure this, right? Do you have data that we can use to measure this? Or is there already existing data sets out there that we can just take and measure this? Okay. Can we take data and then go collect some data to augment that and then test this question? Do we have to start from scratch, and is there no data, and do we have to collect data? Because that's different, right? If you go to a government agency and you're like, hey, we're going to have to completely collect data to answer that because you don't have it and we can't find anyone who does, that changes the entire feasibility of the project. Because if they want this turned around in 1 month, you can't go collect data in 1 month. Right? You probably couldn't even get a survey designed in 1 month and like in a reliable, like we've tested it, we know it's going to work, and now we can deploy it to 10,000 people. So you have to really think, okay, what do you have data for? Okay, what could we answer with that data that we're and then kind of rework back to the problem. And it's like cyclical of like, here's the problem you want to solve, here's the data you have, here's the methods we could do. Okay, go back to the data. Okay, let's go back to the problem, and kind of reworking until it's something answerable. That takes a deep understanding of research validities, particularly when you're getting to external internal validity, a little bit of construct validity as well. It takes a deep understanding of those concepts, because otherwise you start proposing things or framing things in ways that aren't testable. And it also takes a really good understanding of how to formulate methods to test something and be confident in that you're testing what you are testing, which is theoretically an internal validity problem. So that, right, basically, take the first research methods course you take in graduate school and just be rock solid in that. And that's where I actually think the scales are higher than in academia, because when you're doing traditional academic research, you can like, okay, the methods weren't fully fleshed out, but we got them fleshed out to do a grant. Okay, it didn't work, so we're going to modify it. And because you're working on, years often on these grants to work on that, that's fine. You can go through that iterative process. in a consulting space, we don't really have that kind of time. And so we have to be much more confident and much more direct of what we think will work and the methods we know. And so sometimes we need a broader toolkit. I think a lot of times you will notice publishing academics have like one or two methods that they just kind of always rely on, right? And that's just kind of how they do research, and they answer different questions with those. That doesn't fly in the consulting space. You have to at least be able to go learn a new method, or at minimum, you have to know enough about a bunch of different methods that you can apply them, right? Or go read a couple Wikipedia articles and watch some YouTube videos and then be able to apply it. Thank God that there are stats professors out there who feel the need just to make YouTube videos. I don't know why they feel the need to make these YouTube videos, because they don't look like they're part of a class. They're just, you know, people talking, but thank God they do that. And so that's kind of another skill. And then I would also say the tool sets are different. So typically we don't use SPSS, we don't use Stata, because it has to be reproducible. So typically we have to write code in R and Python, R for the more stats leaning folks, Python for the more techie folks. But the reasons for that is because it has to be something that someone else could just pick up and run, right? And if I have, you know, SPSS files and data and all that stuff, that has to be packaged. And then because it's, you know, point and click, someone has to know what I did to create things, and I have to create notes. All that doesn't work. If I'm working in something like R, I have all of that already in the code, and maybe I have some comments in there that tells what it is, and then someone can just take my R code, load it up in RStudio, and rerun it, and then, you know, get the same conclusions, or make a modification and get the conclusions. And that's super important, because oftentimes I'm going to build a model and I'm going to hand it over to someone in the government, a scientist who works for the government, someone like Kate, and I'm going to hand that over and say, here's what we came up with, and then she needs to run with it and be able to do what she needs. And then, you know, a year later they might revisit that, and they aren't going to call us back up and say, hey, how'd you do this? And so those skills are also really important. And I feel like we were at a point probably 5-6 years ago where like being really good with like SPSS and SAS and Stata was fine, and then you could kind of learn the R and Python tools as you go. That's true in some places still, but I would say in general, getting really good with something like R and Python to do analysis with is also a big step. And there's unbelievably amazing resources out there to do that, right? It is, if you already know the math and research part, that's the hard part. Learning the tool is the easy part. That's like going to Home Depot and saying, I know how to build a house, and just picking out hammers and saws. At some point, they all become basically a hammer and a saw, right? You need to know how to build a house. The reverse, though, is not true. I can't know how to use a hammer and a saw and go build a house. That's not going to work, right? Like it's not going to stand. So I can't just go to Home Depot, and people try that. They're like, oh, well, I'm going to go learn, you know, how to use R, or even with Stata and SPSS. Like I'm going to go learn this stat software, but then they can't create research problems, and they don't know enough methods, and they don't know the assumptions of the methods they're using.
That's right.
And it's all worthless, right? So I'd say start with that. Do the normal grads, learn research methods really deeply, learn a bunch of quantitative tools, know how to take an idea, formulate a research question, and answer a hypothesis about that. Know that really well, and then start to say, okay, what tools are people using to do this, right? And it's going to come back to like learning R and Python, and even Julia now is being used a lot of like, hey, like these are more modern quantitative tools people are using to do this.
That's right. So what I've heard also in this is that you've talked a lot about the quant skills that are great, right? Being able to reframe. We're constantly in this series talking about translation and thinking through how you translate and reframe, but also thinking then about, you know, quant skills, and then having some really hard skills, hard quantitative skills, I mean.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I think that consulting is great for, and then perhaps has a very steep curve really quickly, is it's great. It is I'm trying to think of how to say this. It feels like a lifestyle is maybe what I want to go with it, in that people often, and we've said that it's lucrative, but I don't think we've described quite how lucrative it is. Right, that compared to professors and even in research firms, you know, some of the starting salaries start in the 6 figures, like on entry. And then you talk about the skills that Zach has, and he hasn't even mentioned his GIS modeling skills and all these things like that. Those become salary negotiation tools. right? Where now your starting salary walking in the door of your PhD could be 110, 115. We saw one the other day for 135. And so these are lucrative spaces. So if you're, in my experience, people have moved away from traditional academic or traditional universities to these spaces because they arguably have families to feed, and because they're the primary breadwinner, and because these spaces are very, very lucrative very quickly.
Yep.
But then you also said that they demand a lot of your time, and that's right. Like 135 could be a base salary without even your incentive structures, right? Making an obscene amount of money on top of that. So, but they demand your time, and so then they become quickly a space that can help your family in lots of ways, and at the expense of maybe not being as present. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of cultural dynamic in consulting spaces?
Yeah, so that's totally real. When I was at Deloitte particularly was like that. When I was there, I don't think we ever worked less than 60, 65-hour weeks, right? Which sounds like a lot, but like in reality, it's like, 10 to 11-hour days. You get in at 7 and you don't leave till 6. Like it's not that like long, but like that's still a long day, right? And so that's very true, right? Is the expectations are higher because, like I said, timelines are tighter, and we're the customers, in this case government agencies, are paying us a lot of money to solve a problem. We're going to solve it. We're going to solve it in the time frame we promised it, and that's not negotiable. So yeah, the expectations are higher. I will say there's lots of perks as well with that. So like, for example, going back to Deloitte, we all had company Amexes. You could pretty much charge lunch and dinner on it as long as you were being reasonable without, anybody really saying anything. You could charge beverages on it, if this was a meeting that needed to happen at the bar across the street, because some meetings need to happen at the bar across the street, that's perfectly fine, right? Like, like there's perks that come with that. And yes, of course, the salaries are very high. It can get very high very quickly with bonuses and things like that, for sure. I know someone put in here, talking about travel. Like, yeah, like there's travel involved, right? Luckily, with government consulting, it's all really concentrated in the DC area, so you don't have to travel like on a weekly basis, like a lot of like the more businessy consultants are doing, because they're going all around the country all the time. Less of that, but we still travel all the time. I was in Tampa last week because we were presenting findings to a customer, and they needed that to be done in person because of just the dynamic they work in, and that's fine. And so I had to go down to Tampa and present the findings, and we had a conversation about the findings, and they gave feedback, and then we came back, and that's just part of the dynamic. And that's not again, different than academia, except for the fact that we're presenting findings every couple of months to different agencies, which means like we're constantly moving around. Or sometimes you got to go do interviews, and if you're working with a government agency, and yeah, they're headquartered in DC, but their employees are in Monterey, or their employees are in Boise, and so you've got to go out there to interview employees. Obviously, with COVID, it's all very different now. But pre that's what it was like. So there is some travel. I wouldn't say you're gone. I've never been gone all the time. I've been, I'll travel once a month for a couple of days, kind of thing. And yeah, the work hours are definitely long, right? I was in school. Half the reason why, like I said, I should have been ABD 3 years ago when I finished courses, was because like of things like this, right? It just eats into time very quickly. But again, you're being rewarded for that, right? You're being compensated, and if you enjoy high compensation levels, which I know very few people who would say they do not, and that's worth the trade-off for you, then yeah, it can be a lot of fun, and you can make really great money, and you can solve really interesting problems, and you will never be in the news. You're never going to win the Stockholm Prize. You're probably never going to make tenure, but you can see like the results of your work showing up in places, and you're paid really well while you're doing it. So I think it's a balancing act, right? It's definitely going to be a much more intense environment. So for example, at Deloitte, I was passed up for promotion strictly because I did not bill enough hours. My average billing was like 38 hours a week billing to the customer, and then on top of that was other like internal stuff like management, stuff like that. And billing 38 hours a week and then doing all the management stuff on top of that was not enough for promotion, because the people who passed up were billing 50, 60 hours a week and then also doing all the other management stuff on top of that, right? So it's also very competitive cultures, right? Because you have people who are willing to just get in there and just burn those hours and just focus on nothing but work. One of the reasons why I came to Reuters was I personally got out of that space a little bit, just because I needed, with kids and stuff, I needed to slow down a little bit. That doesn't mean I won't return to that kind of space,
Totally.
later on. So
Totally. I think
Real quickly, can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked about the fast pace, but can you take a step back and just talk about kind of what your average day or week would look like?
So in that space, a little different than my current space, but in particularly at the Booz and Deloitte's, right? Oftentimes we were working at our customer sites here in the DC. So you would show up. Sometimes I'd have a badge, like the government would give us a badge to the building. Sometimes they wouldn't, so we'd have to go through the security process and that. Get in probably 7 o'clock in the morning, 7:30. There would be a little bit of death by meeting in the mornings, because most of your job is talking and framing problems and stuff. So we would typically have 3 or 4 meetings, different people throughout the day. You would typically have kind of like team touch points, or we would all work in a room. So we'd be at like the Justice Department, but like all of our team would be in like one room. They gave us like a conference room, and we'd be working in there collaboratively. And then, yeah, like I don't have a desk or an office. I have like a backpack and a laptop, and like I gotta get everything done there, right? Luckily, because of like what we do and like the kind of social science quant space, so much of it was actually just like doing that, right? So much of like my role was just crunching data and fixing data problems and like downloading data and cleaning data and all of that stuff, things that we would always do. It's just on such a compressed timeline that you have to do like what would normally would take, be like, oh, that can take a few months to get all that data clean. It's like, no, we need this done like by Thursday. And so that's kind of just like the process there. I wouldn't say there was like a formal, like, here's what happened every day. And that's also kind of a thing, right? Because the deadlines were always different. The projects were always different. For that, at the Justice Department, that Booz Allen, what the Booz Allen was, we were managing those programs that had more of a structure, because like every Tuesday we were like, here's what requests that came in for the week that we evaluated. We'd present those to the deputy director and say, here's what we think you should go with. They'd give us decisions, and then we would spend the next week executing that, and then more requests would come in. We'd be on like kind of a weekly cadence of working through that stuff and making recommendations. When I was working on the healthcare fraud stuff, we didn't have any of that. We were on, we have a list of problems we're trying to solve. And then, on the quant team, the research team was just kept throwing us like, hey, this would be interesting. Hey, this would be interesting. And then there's adding to the list of things that we're expected to try and build models for. And we're just trying to get them out as fast as we can. And sometimes the data's there and you can, train a model and it looks reliable, within a day. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days and you're just head down focusing on that. It really, what you're working on will dictate what the timetables and paces look like, which is also different because you're not working with long-term objectives, right? When you're embedded in an agency or working in academia, you have long-term objectives you're trying to accomplish, right? We have a 3-year grant we're trying to execute, or, you work at ODOC and here's like the 3 or 4 things we're trying to, do over the next couple of years, and you're working to those. In consulting space, you're working to extremely short-term objectives. You have no long-term horizon at all. And so you're working to short-term, like we have until the end of the month to get this done. And whatever we have to do to get that done by the end of the month, that's a hard stop kind of thing.
So. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like that feels true. When I was at NIJ, Zach was in the building with me, right? So we would he'd be consulting space up on the, on the 8th floor of the OJP building, right? I'm on the 8th floor with all the other consultants, just looking for some fresh air and sunshine, unlike on the 4th floor. And so I think that makes sense, that you're in these spaces where you're constantly producing things at a high speed, because these are for-profit companies, or you're bidding based upon you're bidding based upon underbidding other people, right? One thing that I'm also hearing from this is that the pace is so intense that it also requires then a skill set that allows you to be able to do work on your own with very little oversight.
Oh yeah.
the people who are most successful in these spaces are people who do not need explicit direction and instruction, and who can operate with very little information and very little nudging to get things done.
Yeah, you are the expert. I've never had like a direct manager saying, here's what we're going to do. It's, we have a team of people, we all agree on the direction. You're doing this, I'm doing this, and we come back Thursday and you figure it out for Thursday, right? That's there's never been there's teamwork, but there's this no central planning of things. Like, it's very much on me. Like, I'm handling this part and I'm expected to get this part done, and I'm the expert, so I don't need to go get approval for this. Like, I don't need to go, hey, what do you guys think? It's like, I'm the expert. I'm the one deciding, okay, here's the best way we're going to do this, and coming with that solution, right? So yeah, you do have to be really self-motivated in a lot of ways, and also just self-regulating in a lot of ways to do that, which I actually think that's one thing academia and PhD programs do prepare us for, because that's the same as, in an academic space. If you're, assistant professor, you have your research agenda, and getting publications out and getting things done is based off of your willpower to go apply for grants and get things done and do projects. And that's not unlike the consulting space. So I actually think that's one place where we're really prepared for, right? Because that's kind of the nature of academia as a general, and particularly grad programs, preparing for that. And making that transition, right? Something we're really prepared for. The difference is, if you've been a research assistant or a research associate working underneath someone like Danielle, who is, a tenured professor, typically they've been the ones making the decisions, and they're like, hey, can you go work on this? And you're not going to have that anymore, right? You're going to have to be the one who goes and like has the, okay, we need to get this done. Here's how I think we can do this. But that would be a transition you're gonna have to make, even if you went into traditional academia, right? When you go from research assistant to assistant professor, that's a jump you're gonna have to make as well. And it's a struggle assistant professors have every year, of making that jump of, I'm on my own now, and there's probably thousands of conversations every year where department chairs have to talk to assistant professors of like, you didn't put very much out this year, and that's the reason why. It's because there's learning that self-regulation, self-motivation is a struggle. But like I said, that's not going to be new. We're all getting PhDs, regardless of which track you end up. Like, that's going to be something that we all have to learn to kind of make ourselves an expert and go with that.
That's right. A couple things. I want to be thoughtful of our time. I know that we have typically 5 minutes left on the clock, and so if students have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question. You're also welcome to put it in the chat. Zach, if you have an extra 10 or 15 minutes to lend to your time, we can go, considering I think in part, this is such new information, I think, for a lot of students, particularly for students who are not in the DC metro area, where we're inundated or around people who are in consulting firms. And so I think a lot of it is new. So for the students who cannot see my list of questions, we're about a fourth of the way down. And so thinking through this, what I hear is that the culture, the pace is much faster. I think sounds like the definite difference between a traditional university space and a consulting space. So the pace is exceptionally faster. And so, but all of the skill sets, the how you succeed, successful students, like it all looks the same. It's just like on speed, right? You're just moving so much faster. So, you talked about leaving Deloitte, just kind of taking a break, having a little bit of elbow room. I want to make sure that we kind of get into your work, also still publishing, still teaching. So can you give us kind of a high level overview of kind of like how Reuters then defines itself and how it's different from other consulting firms?
Yeah, so my job at Reuters, so most of you are probably familiar with Reuters News, standard kind of competitor to AP, and kind of like your base news platforms. So Reuters News is owned by a parent company called Thomson Reuters, and Thomson Reuters owns lots of just data collection companies. If you ever used Westlaw in school or in research, that's one of ours. So that like legal database. If you ever used kind of the Clear open record searching system, we have a couple other ones that we, Web of Science. So if you are familiar with what was formerly the Thomson Reuters journal indexing, where we would index the impact factors of various journals. It's done by Clarivate now because we sold that off, but that's all Thomson Reuters. I work in they're a Canadian company, and so we have a U.S. subsidiary called Thomson Reuters Special Services to allow us to work on like government stuff for the U.S. because Canadian companies can't be hired by the U.S. government for obvious reasons. So we take all of that data, right? All of that, we collect all this legal data, we collect all of this open records data, we are analyzing, indexing scientific publications and patents and all that stuff, and we use that to help solve research questions for the government. And so it's a consulting space still, but this one's a little less defined or less undefined because we have data. Like they're coming to us because, oh, you guys have data and we have question. And so my job now is much more of like, you have question, we can kind of mold that question to this, and I have data that can solve that, and I can use this method. And then they can say, oh, okay. And then we work with the agency to say, okay, we have all this data. We built a model based off this data. Here's how it works. We generate a report or give them the model or whatever, and that's the product. So my job here is much more researchy in a more traditional sense, but again, we have all the data, and I'm just taking problems from our customers, and they're kind of saying, here's something we are interested in knowing. So an example is, we're working with the student visa program, and they want to know ways that they can identify company, like how can we have at-risk factors for a company that would be possibly frauding the student visa program? And in that sense, it's like, hey, like students are reporting that some of these universities are not giving them everything that they were supposed to give when they're, getting their student visas, or they're, not complying with paperwork and stuff like that. And it's causing visas to lapse. How can we understand dynamics that would make that? So they'll give us lists. They'll give us like, here's universities that have been flagged for this or charged with this, and then we'll say, okay, that's our sample of for our predictive model. There's our sample of bads, and we can take a random sample of goods, and then take all of our data about all of those companies or those universities, and we can generate models saying, okay, we have a model that can predict that, right? A logistic regression that we can predict that, or some kind of clustering model that can predict that, and then we can answer that. And so here's the features that we found in our data were statistically significant for a university possibly being fraudulent in their visa program. And so again, we're taking a problem, we're taking our data, we're doing traditional quantitative research methods to answer that question.
That's right. So that sounds a little bit different, but I think that actually brings us to one of Nilly's a really good question, which is, we're saying that if you were to ask the outgoing director of NIJ what an evidence-based policy should be, it should be based on 3 randomized control trials would be his standard, right? And so here you have evidence, strong evidence, because it's not like one site. You're talking about big data, right? That's really what you're doing is big data. So, her question is kind of, how are you concerned about providing a very definitive answer to a problem with one data set, so to speak, although the number inside the data set, I'm imagining, is quite large.
Yeah, so our sample sizes are always large, right? We're working in the thousands to tens of thousands. I have a data set I'm working on where it's a couple million observations. So that helps significantly with external validity. Your point, though, Nilly, I agree 100%. We should not take any one-off assessment we do as gospel. And we make that very clear with our customers. We're looking at these data sets, and I'm answering from these data sets. And our team of scientists has thought through the best ways to analyze that. That doesn't mean, one, our data is all knowing, right? That means someone else could bring some other data that completely throws what we're finding out the window. 2 is that we're very clear in our presentations of we're giving you findings as a suggestion, and that these should not be taken as like gold standard. You should never run with the average I give you and say that's the average, we're just going to run with that and make that. That's not what we should ever be doing here. Or because I give you a model that says these features are predictive, don't assume that means in every context that they're predictive. And there's a lot of things. So we have to have a conversation with our funders and customers and clients about, I use Campbell's for framework for validity because that's what we were taught at George Mason. So I talk often in external validity, internal validity, and construct validity. And so we have this conversation with our customer about what that means, right? And why you might want something verified. We have done analyses that have ended up at the White House because they were going through a security customer and resulted in sanctions on a company. We made it very clear, before you sanction another company, someone needs to look this over, or you need to have another review. Like, do not take our report to dictate whether or not you're going to sanction another company. And that gets to your point, Nilly, of like, that's fine if it makes you say, oh, they found this and we should evaluate these sanctions, but don't just take this report we hand you and say, okay, cool, well, we're going to go to this country and we're going to sanction, you know, them for these things, and it's going to completely impact global trade. No, and we're very clear about that with our customers. Like, that's a terrible idea, and and you have to strike that balance, right? Because you don't want to put yourself, you're like, you shouldn't believe anything we say. Like, nothing we give you is important enough to make, you know, trade policy decisions. Like, no, we're telling you what we stand behind, what we gave you. And from our perspective and our data, we stand by what we gave you in our findings. But that doesn't mean that our findings should be the end all be all. And be careful when you make policy decisions based off that. So oftentimes, if it's something like that, we will corroborate it with other things. We'll look at like existing academic research that has already kind of, you know, looked at this and see if there's corroboration between what we find, they find. We'll look at like things that the agency has already known. Sometimes they've already done assessments and they've already learned things, and we're like just continuing what they found. Or oftentimes, more often than not, we say that this is for lead generation. Like, this is for your analyst to have an idea of what to go look into, and then you can make policy decisions based off that. That's very important, because to your point, I'm not doing randomized trials, first off. So there's always, you know, an external validity and an internal validity issue, more specifically. There's always a validity issue. And second off, we're working with our data, which does not mean our data is all encompassing. Now, yes, I'm working with millions of rows of data, which means that, you know, central limit theorem eventually kicks in, and like, I'm probably pretty close, but that doesn't mean that it should be taken as gospel, for sure.
That's right. So then thinking about either for in all of these consulting spaces, you know, I often tell students when I'm talking about them that the process from interview to hire is typically very fast in private spaces, right? That when you are ready to go, be ready to go. And so can you talk us a little bit generally about kind of what the interview to hire process look like, or interview to start date, and kind of how you prep for that, and kind of what that looked like?
Yeah. So everywhere I've worked, I have interviewed and had an offer in the same week. There's never been a delay for that. It's very quickly, because typically they have funding and they have direct like openings for it, right? Now it's competitive because I'm not the only social scientist that they're interviewing for this one social scientist position, right? Like, there's multiple things going on. So typically that'll look like there'll be kind of like a phone screening, and someone, often another scientist in their work, will kind of make sure you're not BSing things, right? And they'll ask some very pointed, quantitative and rigorous questions of just like, hey, like, you know, tell me about this, and ask about your past experience, but from like a technical standpoint of like, oh, when you did that method, how did you control for this? And like, ask very pointed questions that, you know, if you're not BSing, you should be able to answer. If you read a stats book and now you're trying to sell yourself as a scientist, you would not be able to answer. And so those are typical part of that. And then once you're cleared past that, they're like, okay, this person knows their stuff. Typically, it's much more hands-on. Like, most of my interviews have been, you know, let's say we have a problem and we kind of talk through it, right? So when I was at Deloitte, they literally had me design a study on the fly, and they just kept asking questions or throwing curveballs at it, and like we would actually design what we were going to do, and then asked me rigorous questions. I got asked, so what would happen if you had a negative R-squared value come out of your regression model? Fun fact: R-squareds cannot be negative; they're scaled 0 to 1, and that almost got me. I was like, wait. Oh wait, what? You couldn't do that? And then like he was like, "I got you." I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "No, that's not a thing." And so stuff like that, just like, you know, if you think about it, we all know that. We're like, wait, my R-squared value is going to be scaled 0 to 1. Like, that's not, you wouldn't have a negative one. That would never be a thing. And it's all just weeding out the BS, because there's a lot of people who don't have the rigorous skills. And like I talked about, we don't have time for someone who kind of knows how to do this to get in there. We need people who can do this. Like, we can say, run with this and, you know, build us a model and have it ready in a couple weeks. And so there's those conversations, and there's just culture conversations. Like someone will come in, just kind of get a sense of how you work, get a sense of your dynamics. If you can't talk to people and you can't explain what you did and your findings, consulting's not going to work for you, right? I've got to be the one that can translate what I did directly to the person who's going to use it, and they've got to be able to take that in, and that's everything. I'm not going to write a report that someone else can then go and translate that report for them. There's not going to be that buffer space. So that's a big part. I've got to also be able to boil things down, which those of us who teach should have a good ability to do that, right? Part of academia is teaching, and part of that we should be good at that as well. But you've got to be able to throw curveballs like, well, what if that value is negative? And in a very respectful way, explain that, an R-squared value is, a normalized value between 0 and 1, and not get statty about it, right? I'm not going to explain that. I'm not going to start getting into what normal distributions of residuals would be. I'm going to try and explain, well, this value typically comes between this for this reason, so that wouldn't be possible. If it was, we'd understand that something was actually wrong in the computations, and we wouldn't even believe. Like, you have to go into something about that. And so, yeah, so typically, you'll go through like a phone screening, make sure you're not, BSing anybody. You'll go through more of like a rigorous in-person interview. For my one here at Reuters, they all read my master's thesis and showed up ready to like basically make me defend my master's thesis again, which no one briefed me for. And I hadn't read in like 2 years, and that was, because it was available on the university website, and so they all were just like, oh, well, here's here's this master's thesis from 2 years ago. Let's just pick this and let's pick his brain on it, which was fun, but I wasn't prepared for that. So I walked in, they're like, hey, yeah. And they just like pulled it out. I'm like, oh my, here we go. Which, by the way, if your master's thesis was like my master's thesis, that was not my best work. So that was also not like,
mine was about pirates, maritime pirates.
I remember that.
Yes, mine's on ransom and maritime piracy, which is a thing, people. It's a thing.
I remember you showing off parts of that, like when you got to Mason. Anyway, so
it's a weird thing.
So they were asking me like, methods questions of why'd you do this, why'd you do that, like what was your assumptions here, like why was this your unit of analysis? And their point was because that was a analysis I did, that was a report I produced, it was a thesis, and they were picking me the same way someone else who was trying to use that for actionable would, right? Like, tell me why you did this, tell me what this means, tell me how you got to this. Not unlike a job talk would be in an academic sense, right? Now, a job talk, you're going to prepare yourself and come in, but then you're going to get grilled with questions like that as well. So if you're already comfortable standing behind what you know, solving a problem, and then defending your results or talking about the limitation of your results openly, that's what these conversations end up being, right? They're not abnormal to what you're used to. The difference is they're looking to make sure that like they're going to go a little bit more breadth than they would in like an academic interview, because like I said, you have to be able to do more than just like that one method you used on your master's thesis, which I actually flat out said in my Reuters interview. I'm like, look, I was a master's student. I didn't spend the time I should have really understanding that method before I applied it. That's not something I would do anymore. And I was like, that was definitely a learning curve, right? Like I didn't fully understand the assumptions of how Gaussian mixture models worked when I did that. And so that's, and then typically offers come very quickly, and there's a lot of negotiation. I would say to anyone on this call, if you go into the private sector, if you go into the consulting space, or even like the think tank space or the research space, like when I'm at Reuters, and they give you an offer, counter. Don't take the first offer, because again, these are for-profit companies, so they make more money when people are paid less. It's just the unfortunate side of capitalism. So understand that like they're not offering you the best they can offer you. They're offering you what they think is enough to get you to say yes, and it's low enough that it doesn't cost them as much money. I flat out rejected the first offer here, and it was just not high enough, and we negotiated up, and if you're the right fit and you're what they're looking for, then that's fine. If they want to pay less and get someone who knows less, then that's also fine. They can go do that. That's just what they're going to do. Or if they're like, maybe we can't afford the PhD level, we're going to step down to master's level because this is all we can pay, then that's fine. I would say hold out, right? I would say, there's enough value for us in the government and consulting space to hold out and say like, hey, don't settle for what seems like, And oftentimes I see people, oh, well, it's more than I would have made, if I took an academic job, but you're way less than what you should be making here in this space, right? Like you're now making, a third of what everyone, no, not a third, but like 2/3 of what everyone here at the table is making because you held out. So the whole purpose of going into consulting, in my opinion, is to solve problems because that's fun and to make more than you would have in other spaces.
That's
It's
right.
not worth the cost and what we give up to do that if you're not doing that. And so that's kind of the third part of the interview, is that back and forth.
I think that part is really important, that you're about to walk into a fast-paced culture that is demanding and to also demand what you're worth.
Yeah.
And that in other spaces, we haven't quite been told. I think for me, when I was negotiating, I didn't know what I was worth because I was only ever worth my GRA, right? And so my skills had never been like actually operationalized to be something, to be an actual number. And so it was very challenging to say like, okay, they gave me an offer. What can I actually do here? How much can I push back? And now I'm, calling friends like you who are in different spaces saying, push back 20 grand, push back 25 grand, right? And then finding a balance that I think is fair for what I can do, not fair because the alternative is traditional academe that is paying 65, right? Like it's not that it's fair there, it's what is fair here in this sandbox.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's really important. And I think a good friend of mine used to do the books at CACI, and his conversation to me was that he saw how much people made, and generally speaking, the difference wasn't because they weren't worth it; it was because they didn't ask.
Yeah.
And really emphasizing the ask, like push that they've already offered you the position. You saying no, I want this is not going to be like, we're going to take the whole thing off the table.
Right.
It's going to be, okay, let's find something that works for us. Like they've already invested in you. They've wrapped their head around you. They want you. It's worth them to go back and forth. You saying something extreme, they're going to say no.
Yeah.
How about, not like, no, kick rocks, we're not hiring you at all. That's just not how it works.
Absolutely.
I do want to spend some time in that real quickly and saying that, you've spent a lot of time in this consulting space. You've talked about how it's taking you longer to do your PhD. We get it. We've all been there. Same. And so, how do you also then teach and get your dissertation done and write if you wanted to write, or how do you maintain networks to be able to write when, per what you're saying, is I don't have traditional data to write from?
Yeah, so part of my agreement here at Reuters was, it's in my contract, I have academic access to their data sets as long as their like copyright attorneys get to look at it beforehand. So I have put out stuff, to conferences and stuff that I used our data for, and it just goes through copyright, but to make sure I'm not, giving away anything that would be a business thing or making any PII violations. Lawyers sign off on it, and that's part of my contract. I asked for that, right? That's an option when you're at a place like I am that has like data, and I can like be like, hey, I want access to this data, right? That's the thing. When you're at other places, find ways to make the win-win. So like, from a publishing standpoint, find ways that you can say, hey, Medicare and Medicaid services, we're working on this. I'm going to do this part for you. Can you put it in writing? A good consulting firm will help you negotiate. Like, I also want to publish that in an academic stance. Can we take this data and have that conversation, and deals can be made, right? And agreements can be put in writing. So the publishing thing, you just have to look creative, right? I'm not getting grants to give me funding to go collect data that I can go write 3 or 4 papers off of. That's just not, the work I'm in. So I have to look for other ways to get access to data. I work with mostly open data. The great thing about the modern times is most, local governments are putting their data out there, and you can start to collect open data. I work with big text data all the time, right? For my dissertation, I'm using Google data and Twitter data that's coming from Google and Twitter, because they make their data somewhat available for researchers. So you just have to look for other ways that are not, I'm going to go design a survey and collect data, because that's just not going to be an option. I don't have the time to go do a survey when I'm also doing what I'm doing here. And in the teaching standpoint, that usually actually goes over pretty well. I just have to work my schedule around it. So typically, I teach mostly afternoon and nights. And typically it's just a conversation of like, hey, I'm going to leave, at this time because I'm going to teach at American. I'm already in downtown, so I'm going up to Tinleytown. Sorry for anyone not from the DC area. And I'm going to, go up there and teach there and then come back. And as long as everyone's on the same page, that's never been an issue ever, right? As long as you're still getting your work done, your time done, and all that stuff, it's never been an issue. And it's actually a selling point because a lot of the firms I work at end up selling it. It's like, hey, this guy teaches this stuff also at two, decent universities, and they actually, try and flip that as a marketing thing, which is fine. And so yeah, it's never been an issue for me to do that. Time management wise, I make up about 25% of Starbucks' annual revenue. And so that's also, a thing is I have a lot of days. Today is one of those days where I'm going to be here for 8 hours or so doing not mentally light things at all. And then I get home and I've got, a self-inflicted deadline that I've got to meet, and I've got to go work on stuff. So I'm going to go home, put my kid to bed, and I'm going to get my personal laptop out and work for another 3 or 4 hours. And, I'm going to be basically brain dead by the time I go to bed. That's not an uncommon day. And that's kind of the playing in two sandboxes thing, is that both sandboxes demand time, right? And managing that's hard. I miss things a lot. I miss emails a lot. Shannon sent me this invite like 3 times before I finally accepted, because I'd already agreed to do it, but just because like my email management's not that great, and when multiple things are colliding like that, then sometimes things get missed. You just got to kind of roll with it. I apologize for late responses a lot in emails. Understanding those caveats, it's manageable, right? I will say I'm learning now with 2 kids. It's going to slow for me, right? I was in my late 20s single phase, and I could just crank stuff out. That's changing for me now. Sure. I don't know what that change will look like yet. I know other people who do it and they're able to do it, but it's just different, right? And it's more difficult. And so I'm kind of learning myself of what this is going to look like for me for the next few years, and how much I'm going to realistically be able to do. Hopefully this PhD will be done by the end of this year, and then that's one less thing that I'm having to worry about. But for right now, that's a thing that's going on. So yeah, it's not, I wouldn't say it's easy, but I also wouldn't say it's hard, right? I would say it's just something that you just have to manage, and you can't just expect your schedule is just going to kind of coast, right? If you want to do the whole two sandboxes thing I do, which I feel like most people I know coming from our space end up wanting to do, right? You want to at least keep teaching, because I've never had a university, I've ever met anyone who works at university. It's like, hey, you need adjuncts? They're like, no, we got all the adjuncts we need. That's literally the opposite of every university right now, right? So it's like, hey, or especially you need qualified adjuncts, right? That's also the thing there. They've got adjuncts, but any of us who had an adjunct in undergrad know that not all adjuncts are created the same. You want an adjunct that has all the qualifications of a regular professor and is choosing not to go down that route. And if you're working on research projects, most established academics are perfectly fine saying hey, can I work on this project with you? I'm working on stuff with traditional academics that I in my free time help with. I may not be a list author at all in these because I'm not contributing that much. I might, if I am, I'm going to be 7th author, right? It's not I'm not going to be first, second author on these things, but I'm helping, I'm contributing the best I can. I'm involved in discussions, etc. So you can do it both. It's just understanding where your time commitments lie and balancing between those is the thing.
So yeah, I feel exhausted listening to you, because that is not my life. I won't tell you that I scrambled out of bed maybe at 8 o'clock this morning. I think you were probably up and moving and had 4 cups of coffee and did 5,000 activities and tasks before 8 a.m. But yeah, what I hear that's optimistic is that as part of your negotiations of salaries in this places, you can negotiate open access to data, you can negotiate time to be able to teach, right? Part of my negotiation, I negotiated the ability to move to Asia for a project I was thinking about doing pre-COVID, of course, that obviously has come off the table since COVID. And so, I think that there's space to negotiate for things that you want in these private spaces. You just need to ask for them up front. Yep. And that you're worth it because you offer skills that other folks do not have. And so
that's key. Let's tell that further. Understand what we offer, right? Understand that we've gone through rigorous years of schooling to be very good at framing research questions and using quantitative and qualitative skills to answer those in a reliable way. Not everyone does that, and a lot of people attempt to do that and don't have the background we have, right? So that's where you get in when you hear horror stories all the time of statistical models that were made by people who don't really have any business making models, and that's an issue. So understand that, like, I think a lot. I've had other colleagues who have made this transition, and they feel like it's like, well, I don't know the consulting space, and like I'm new here, and they don't feel like they're bringing a lot to the table. Understand what we bring. Less than 1% of the population gets a PhD. It's hard, and we learn a lot, and we have very valuable skills in the right context. Sorry, I cut you off, but I think that was an important thing to make
No,
sure.
but I think that the point is well heard. And so I've now extended you to 90 minutes, which is about where I'm going to cut us off. So I want to make sure if people who are left here have any questions, if they want to chime in. And then lastly, just saying, I know that you have your own consulting firm, and kind of, what is the benefit of having your own consulting firm, and how do you set that up?
Yeah, I did that so I could work on projects I wanted to work on. And I never have more than like 1 or 2 people I'm working with at a time. But I did that so that I could shape long term. Ideally, I would just do that. Like long term, I would, and when that becomes something that I could rely on. But I did that because I had been in the business long enough to know like how to create statements of work and all that. And like I learned like the business side of it just from doing it. And so I wanted to say, so what we do in my firm is we help local agencies and state agencies reframe policies away from policing and traditional justice and more towards, places and thinking about design as the solution. And I'm real passionate about, design, which for the record does not mean, visual art or anything. Design just means taking a specific goal and creating a specific solution for it. And I'm real passionate about that is where we need to be going with justice, is that we need to be saying, I have this hotspot and I design a solution for that hotspot. And we need to get away from saying, I have New York City and I want to reduce all crime in New York City. That's an unreasonable goal. And it's why, in my opinion, justice agencies have failed for decades, because we're trying to solve what is really the culmination of, thousands of little problems with one big solution, right? And so that's what we do, is we're trying to apply things like CEPTED and design thinking and deeper analytics and stuff like that to help unravel specific crime problems and come up with specific solutions to them, applying things like situational crime prevention, stuff like that. So reaching into the traditional criminology thinking for sure, and taking that step to apply that in a very design forward way. I did that just because I want to do that. No one was doing that. None of the firms I was at really wanted to do that. And I was like, well, okay, screw it. I'll just do it myself. So I just created a little LLC here in Virginia where I live, and that allows me to do that. I don't have a lot of bandwidth, do it a lot, right? And the most I can ever offer the people I'm working for is like 5 to 10 hours a week, because that's all I got left in me. But it allows me to work on things that like I wanted to do, and I don't have to think about like I'm getting paid elsewhere, so like the funding is also not a huge issue. Like I can do it for like fairly cheap if that's all that they're able to do it for, and things like that. I have done pro bono work because it just was a cool project, and it was like, I can't give you more than like 5 hours a week, but I'll do it pro bono. And they're like, sure, come on in. So yeah, I did that just for my own sake. I'm still here at Reuters. I'm at Reuters now, doing my job here, and I just have to be careful not to let my own personal work overtake my work here. And so yeah, so that's also the third niche, right? I have obligations to Reuters, I have obligations to universities, and then that's kind of my own like when I can fit it in kind of thing. I will tell you that has been a challenge the last few months. I think I a little overscheduled myself a little bit, but that's something I'm remedying. So
totally. Yeah. We're all learning the power of saying no, I think, in these COVID times.
But there's so many interesting problems to work on. Like, how do you say no? Yeah. So anyway.
It's hard. It's hard. I know. I've had to say no a few times recently. Well, look, Zach, I am so thankful that you've now donated 90 minutes of your very, very expensive time to us and to talk us through this. I want to, are you comfortable with us sharing your email address?
Absolutely.
With students, should they have questions?
Yeah.
And so we'll have the full posting on the DCS website. So I'll send you a link should you want to disseminate it to your own networks. It'll be there with the students along with the chat and the questions that we ask. For the students that are still on the call, we're really excited about our next meet and greet with our next rec star. His name is Dr. Wilkes, and he works at the Inter-American Development Bank. And so he works in an international space, using research in international space to think through Caribbean and South American development issues. So really excited to talk with him about how we transition to an international space, how he navigates international space, and what research can and should look like there. So from excited for that. That'll be March, and you'll all learn more details about here shortly. But thank you again so much, Zach, for joining us and for sharing with us all that you know about this. And I know that we didn't even scratch the surface of how to navigate it all.
Yeah, we didn't get through all of your questions by like a long
we
shot.
didn't, but you know what? We did a good job. I feel like
Yeah.
we answered some other questions that weren't on there, so it's totally okay.
Yeah. I will add, share my email and stuff. People feel free to, find me on Twitter. I will be honest, Twitter is sometimes a more reliable way to get a hold of me than like the rest of things. That's also something I'm working through. But yeah, feel free to, if anyone wants to find me, has follow-up questions, reach out to me directly. I'm happy to talk, or if I can, be assisting in your transition or your network, please let me know. I'm always at ACGS and ASC as well. If anyone wants to, hit up for drinks or coffee at those things when they're going. Obviously, we didn't have ACGS this year, but we are having ASC apparently. So see you all in the fall if that's still on, or if it's even safe to go. We'll see. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate it.
Take care. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.